Hello and welcome to another lesson as we continue to come out of lockdown in Scotland, now into phase 2 and looking forward soon, we hope, to phase 3. I was at the building on Thursday in East Kilbride. I snapped a few photos of the flowers. Many from my last visit are now gone and there are others blooming. These red hot pokers are still around, but I think they're getting a bit past their prime, but still beautiful. I love that particular flower. I did notice that as you walk up the steps towards the building, that the irises are in full bloom. It was lovely seeing them. And I also found these beauties in the rockery beside the gate that we drive in. And I believe these are wood lilies. If somebody knows different, they can tell me. We're now, of course, in our phased lifting of lockdown in Scotland. We are in phase 2. Nicola Sturgeon announced on Wednesday further proposed dates of our coming out of lockdown, so I thought I'd rehearse those just very quickly here. The rest of the dates then will be announced at the 9th of July review, and these are unlikely to start before the 23rd of July. So anyway, here's what we're looking at. The 29th of June, we're going to have some indoor workplaces opening and street access retail shops opening. So not things that are shopping center and closed shopping centers, but at least there will be shops open. On the 3rd of July, travel restrictions should be relaxed, which means we can go on a holiday as long as right now it's self-catering accommodation. So we are planning on going on a holiday, but not quite yet. But looking forward to that. Then once we get to phase 3, they've announced these initial dates for what they hope will be the lifting of some more of lockdown. On the 10th of July, extended groups can meet outdoors, and households can meet indoors with a maximum of 2 other households. As you know, right now we can only meet with 2 other households outdoors. But extended groups then outdoors and households meeting indoors with a maximum of 2 other households. Looking forward to that. This weekend in particular is going to be supposed to be a very wet weekend, and which means we really can't spend any time with our grandson. But nevertheless, that's the way life is in Scotland, isn't it? On the 13th of July, they're looking to see dental practices and essential emergency eye care being able to take place. And on the 15th of July, holiday accommodation in general permitted, indoor hospitality open, hairdressers, cinemas, childcare. So that's when they're hoping to see the most things coming out of lockdown. And then, as I mentioned, on the 9th of July, they will announce the dates for the rest of the lockdown to be lifted, although they said these are unlikely to start before the 23rd of June. And this, by the way, will include congregational worship indoors with physical distancing and limited numbers. Now, we say limited numbers right now. I do not think that's going to pose a problem for us at East Kilbride because we're a small group anyway. So I think we're going to be okay there. And of course, schools will be reopening on the 11th of August. Shielding will continue until 31st of July with the current restrictions, but allowing outdoor exercise, of course, and meeting people from one other household outdoors. On the 31st of July, this will be updated with more specific guidance based on individual risk profiles. So I'm not really looking to see everybody being able to worship probably until August, especially those who are in the shielding category. I spoke with Trevor Williams during the week. This is the week we start putting together the Christian Worker, and it'll be out midweek next week. But we were talking about, because in England, they're able to resume worship on the 5th of July, but with physical distancing and restricted numbers and no singing. Now, singing has not been specifically mentioned up here, but it has been identified as a particular problem due to the projecting, the way you sing, and inhaling the air you need to sing. So this means that we may be able to resume worship in Scotland on the 26th of July. So it's another 5 weeks. But at this stage, my suggestion would be that we begin with Sunday morning worship only and look to add classes in later, especially as those who are shielded are able to come out of that. Got some ideas about how we will be able to have some songs, maybe not necessarily with using our voices, but we'll see what the restrictions are when they are published. But for the time being, I'll continue recording these lessons, continuing putting these on our YouTube channel. In this lesson, I want to be in Luke chapter 12. And I've entitled this lesson, Where is Our Treasure? Now, to keep us in our timeline as to when all these things were happening, we are now in chapter 12. And it would seem that Jesus and his disciples are still in Judea. Possibly they're in Jerusalem. I place this in December of 29 AD, so just a week or so after what we saw in chapter 10 and 11. What's contained in this chapter is very similar to teaching that Jesus did earlier in Galilee that's recorded by Matthew in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of his biography of Jesus. The first verse of chapter 12 gives us a bit of a setting for what takes place within this chapter. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on each other, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." So this is coming at the tail end of what we looked at in our last lesson, Jesus' warnings against the Pharisees. So we still have a little bit of that, but we have a huge crowd that's gathered in the photograph that I'm using there. You can see the Pharisees there in the background, but Jesus surrounded by a crowd of people. Having said that, when Luke records, there are many thousands, so many that they're stepping on each other. So that seems to be what's going on there. We're going to pick up in verse 13 with this in this lesson. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool! This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself?" This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. This is what we usually refer to as the parable of the rich fool. This man has sudden wealth, but he ends up being a fool. And we know he's a fool because he's identified as such by God. So let's look at this parable just for a second. The background of this parable is that there's been an argument over inheritance. And somebody wanted more. I get the impression it's the younger son here who's the one who is raising this problem. If you remember, under the Mosaic law, under the law of Moses in the Old Testament, that when there was the inheritance, the oldest son got a double portion. There seems to here be two sons, which means that the older son would have gotten 2/3, and the younger son only 1/3. And he's not too happy with this. He wants more. So Jesus tells a story. And in this story, the man has what we would call today a bumper crop. And as he sees it, he's got a problem. What will I do with it? Yeah, indeed. Think about that. He could have done so much having this bumper crop. But the problem was he could only see himself. He had what I would refer to as eye trouble. 7 times in this short parable, as he's talking to himself, he uses the word I or my, a personal pronoun. He has eye trouble. He could only see himself. And he died that night. He never got to use the crop that he had, this bumper crop, this wealth that he was so much looking forward to just taking it easy for the rest of his life. You know, the problem was his heart, wasn't it? He was greedy. The lesson, Jesus says, is that our life isn't about what we have. And sadly, so many people today still make that the basis of their living, of their life. And they define people by what they have and what they don't have. Well, what about us? I would suggest we need to look in the mirror, especially if we see this as a story about others, about someone else, and not see that this has an application for each one of us. What about us? Do we struggle to give to others? You know, how do we tell if we're greedy like this man? Well, we need to be asking ourselves these questions, don't we? Do we struggle to give to others? Are we quick to make excuses as to why we don't use what we have to help others? Do we ask questions like that? Do we ask questions so that we look like we are careful stewards? And often those who don't want to use their wealth do that to make themselves look good. And when we give, do we feel that the other person then owes us something? In other words, are there strings attached to our giving? And those are serious questions, aren't they? But those are the things that I think we can draw out of this particular bit of Jesus' teaching. Looking in the mirror, making that application to us. Have you ever thought about this? What do others see in us? What's our lives based on? Do people feel they are competing with our stuff? Do people think we value our stuff more than we value them? Do people have to beg to get anything financial from us? In fact, are people afraid to talk to us about financial issues, about financial struggles? Remember what Jesus said. Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. So what's the real problem here? Well, Jesus says the problem is greed. We need to be on our guard. And this is one of the most subtle problems we can have in our lives. We might think of ourselves as being very faithful to God, but we may be a greedy person. And we may not even think, in fact, I don't know many greedy people, if any, that think of themselves as being greedy, but a lot of times we really are. For the greedy person, stuff, what we own, is our life. A greedy person has bought into the lie that my stuff is my life. To tamper with or ask for or damage their stuff is personally threatening to them. That's greed. And their stuff is basically an extension of who they are. But what did Jesus say? Life does not consist in what you have. What's the driving force behind greed? I would suggest that the driving force is fear. You see, we are afraid of what might happen if we lose what we have. That's fear, isn't it? Greed is supported by an endless list of what ifs. Yeah, I can't help you because what if? And I've heard that so many times in my life. No, I can't do this because what if this were to happen? Well, you know, the chances are it won't happen. What's the real issue here? I would suggest that the real issue is that we are afraid God won't take care of us in the way that we want to be cared for. I would suggest that maybe we don't need to be cared for in the way that we want to be cared for. See, the bottom line is we don't really trust God. We don't trust Him to take care of us. We don't trust Him that He will provide for the necessities of life. Of course, maybe the problem is we want more than the necessities of life. See, we only trust ourselves. And therein is the problem. A man, I don't know who he is, Walter Schloss, found this on the internet, said fear and greed tend to affect one's judgment. And they do. It does, doesn't it? Greed and fear combined really affect how we view things. Andy Stanley wrote a book called Enemies of the Heart, and he talked about greed. He said, so greedy people shoulder the burden to acquire and maintain everything they need to provide the sense of security they desire. But therein lies the problem. There's never enough. There's always another what if that drives them to acquire more. They never feel like they have quite enough, which of course is the very thing they fear. Consequently, greedy people are rarely at peace with others and never at peace with themselves. And I must admit, those I know who are driven by this, especially driven by security, I want to feel secure. You know, they are always wanting more because they're never secure. And I'd suggest that the bottom line there is there's not a trust in God to provide what we need. They never feel like they have quite enough. As Andy Stanley says, they're rarely at peace with others. They're never at peace with themselves. And that's what I have seen as well. See, rather than living in fear of what we might not have, we need to learn to trust in God. Jesus goes on in Luke chapter 12, and he put it this way. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moths destroy. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So we could have entitled this lesson, Where is Our Heart? Where is it? Where's our heart? What can we learn from all of this? Well, the big lesson that comes from the parable, of course, is life is more than what we have. But from this last bit here, which very much parallels what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, which would have been earlier and up in Galilee. This seems to be taking place in Judea. But here's a lesson we need to learn. Don't worry. Don't worry. Now, I realize that is easier said than done, isn't it? Worry seems to even be built into our lives. But, I think it's largely because of fear. Fear of not being able to have. Notice what Jesus said there. God takes care of the birds. Birds don't have to plant. Birds don't have to harvest to get food. God takes care of them. And then notice what Jesus said. We are more valuable than birds. So what's Jesus saying here? Is he not saying God will take care of us too? Yeah. God takes care of the birds. God will take care of you. Then he talked there a little bit about worrying and says worrying doesn't add anything to our lives. In fact, he says it takes away from our lives. And it does, doesn't it? Worry takes a lot from us. We use so much energy worrying about things that will never happen, that if we spend that time productively, we could get a lot more done. Then he talked about the wildflowers, how God makes the wildflowers beautiful. And again, his point is, if God does this, he will take care of us as well. So don't worry. And then he talks about what we must do. He says what we need to do is seek his kingdom. Seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. In other words, I think we could put it this way. We need to get our priorities right. We need to get our priorities right. Don't be afraid of losing what we have. Why? Because God has given us so much more. He has given us his kingdom. So we don't need to worry about using what we have to help others. We don't have to worry about that at all because we have something far greater. And we don't have to worry about even giving it to help the kingdom because he's given us the kingdom. So don't be afraid of losing what we have. Instead, he says we need to be storing treasure in heaven that will never fail. That's what we need to be doing. If we store treasure in heaven, it can't be lost. It can't be stolen. It can't be destroyed. It's in an eternal bank account, if you will. We send that ahead of us into eternity. And as Jesus put it, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And that's the question for us, isn't it? Where is our treasure? Let's seek to be storing our treasure in heaven. As we think about that, think about the week we have coming up ahead of us. We're coming out of lockdown. We need to, as we come out, can still continue to build ourselves up spiritually, don't we? Prayer and Bible study are so very important in our lives, and hopefully we've been able to do more as we've been in lockdown. Don't lose that. Hang on to that, because that's so vital to our lives as Christians. But we also need to be laying up treasure in heaven, as we've been studying. Well, how do we lay up treasure in heaven? Remember, Jesus defined this as helping others, as using what we have, and not being attached to what we have. Now, we're still limited a bit in what we can do, especially in conjunction with seeing other people, but at least be thinking about how we can store up treasure in heaven. Think about how we can be more effective disciples of Jesus. And by all means, do what we can. Encourage others. Even study with others. I've been blessed to be able to have studies during lockdown, even studies this past week on the telephone. Because we can do that, can't we? Of course, I've been teaching classes as well for the British Bible School through Zoom. But yeah, do all that we can to help others. Find ways of helping. Of course, I would encourage you, as I do every week during lockdown, tune into the Sunday message from the British Bible School on YouTube. Mark Hill should be bringing us our message this week, so we look forward to that. Break bread at home. Study God's Word every day. And if you can, join us in our BBS Zoom classes. We've had our first lessons, and they're beginning to go up on the BBS YouTube channel. And it's been encouraging to me to see so many continuing to study with us. And we've had a lot of new names this particular week. And so looking forward to seeing them and getting to know them. But in the meantime, as I keep saying, and as we keep being told, stay safe. Stay safe. Follow the government guidelines. Maintain the 2-meter social distancing right now. And that's vital. Wash your hands frequently. And let's keep this this deadly virus at bay. Continue to suppress it. I was very much heartened today. I'm recording this on Friday. Very much heartened today to hear, as Nicholas Sturgeon gave out the figures for the past 24 hours, that we had no deaths in Scotland due to coronavirus. That was brilliant to hear, because that's the first time it's been no deaths on a weekday, not on the weekend. On the weekend, there's fewer reports, but the first time on a weekday, no deaths. In Scotland, we are continuing to suppress the virus. Our number is between 0.6 and 0.8 now, which is, I think, about the lowest in the UK, and we're very happy that that's happened. Yes, we're taking our time coming out, but we're also making sure that we suppress this virus. So let's cooperate with the government and continue to do this. Have a good week, and we'll have at least another month of lessons in this manner.